Hey, how's everybody doing? I hope you're all staying safe and healthy under the current conditions. As It's Monday night, so we're kind of pushing through our first full day of the kind of stay in your home, except for visiting grocery stores, exercise, and unless you work for a employer that provides essential services. That's kind of the current state that we're in. But this is lecture 13, and hopefully you're staying up with the lectures. I posted a video that runs through the updated syllabus. Hopefully you've watched that. I noticed it doesn't have a whole lot of views, but I do cover some important material there in terms of the class moving forward. And I am posting lecture slides, but hopefully you're kind of like tuning into the videos because I do go through the lecture and it might help you kind of understand the material a little better than if you just read the lecture itself. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with you to get moving here. The first thing we're going to do today essentially is kind of getting out of control. I'm just trying to make this bigger. The first thing I want to do today is talk about current coronavirus policy in New York. There's some actions, of course, that you're probably aware of that were taken recently that are that bring up some important concepts or relate or kind of show how some of the important concepts we've talked about in class are playing out in reality, in this case, in the context of the coronavirus. We're also going to talk about the midterm exam. We're going to cover instruments of public policy and lecture. And then I'm going to post a quiz. So, the quiz will be due by the end of Wednesday evening. So hopefully by that time you'll have tuned into the lecture and done the reading, and we'll be able to reply to the quiz, which is not all that difficult, but you should be engaging with the material for this day, Tuesday, in order to complete the quiz successfully. So first, before we get into the lecture, I want to cover some policy stuff related to class that's currently going on in the state. So as you're probably aware, Cuomo recently issued an order that requires basically everyone to stay inside unless you're kind of like going to the store, getting exercise, going to the hospital, or you are employed by an employer that provides an essential service. This kind of policy was established first in California. I always bring up California because in a lot of cases they seem to be the first actor on certain issues, but California was kind of the first actor to establish a policy such as this in response to the coronavirus. Really the goal, of course, is to essentially slow the spread of the virus, right? That's really the efforts that are being put in place now at this point in many states and cities, is to slow the spread of the virus such that health centers, hospitals are not overwhelmed with people who need to be treated. And that's really the goal with a lot of policies that are being established at this point. And so, we don't have a national policy regarding mobility in terms of controlling the spread of coronavirus. And so in the absence of that federal action, which I'm not saying that should happen, but in the absence of that kind of national type of policy, many states and some cities are taking action, which is an example of decentralization, right, that we've talked about in class, that many states are doing this. And in some cases, you see states adopting very similar policies, other states adopting unique policies to slow the spread. But nonetheless, you see kind of states taking action at their own pace. And even Cuomo, right, initially adopted a 50%, first started with closing bars and restaurants, right? De Blasio closing, Mayor Bill de Blasio closing bars and restaurants. Then you saw Cuomo come in and say 50% of workforce should stay home, then 75%, and then finally this order establishing only those that are performing essential services or getting exercise or going to the store are allowed to leave. Again, this is an example of decentralization. The order in New York State was established through executive order. And so we've talked about executive orders, that these are things that come from the executive branch, the mayor, the governor, a president, in the US anyway. And they have, they're like laws, right? But they're not coming from the legislative branch, they're coming from the executive branch. And so that's what this is an executive order established by Cuomo. Mayor Bill de Blasio initially talked about doing something like this in the city. He and the mayor and the governor have clashed on policy issues in the past, and they clashed on this, where Cuomo would not let de Blasio issue a stay-at-home order for the entire city, and saying that, that the city can't do that without the state's approval, and that was true. Where this is an example of kind of like federalism, where states are kind of this unique, or cities, excuse me, are kind of these unique entities where they gain their authority to do things from the state, right? They're kind of like adolescents or like wards of the state, like kids, the state's kids, right, for example. And so in order for a city to do something like establish a stay-at-home rule, the city would need state's approval. And Cuomo was not going to give de Blasio that approval. And so there was in the media some butting of heads on this issue. And ultimately, Cuomo decided to establish a stay-at-home rule. And this is now a statewide executive order, right? Not just for the city of New York. And so, you know, just kind of looking through this article from the Times, which I'll post on Blackboard. But again, since Cuomo's order, other governors have kind of taken action relatively quickly. Most notably, you see Connecticut and New Jersey establishing very similar orders. And that's also brings back a point we've talked about in class, that when we talk about a public problem, we have to think about the scale of that problem and kind of the nature of the problem, right? And we're talking about something like the coronavirus. This is not a problem that a public problem or a public issue that respects like political boundaries, right? It's not bound by, it doesn't exist only in the city of New York. It doesn't exist only in the state of New York. It can travel, right? And so when you live in a region like the Northeast region, where you have states in really close proximity to one another, and you have kind of this transboundary issue like the coronavirus, it becomes increasingly important that states enact regional approaches to addressing the issue, because if only New York established this order, and Cuomo mentioned this also in several press briefings, that if it was only New York that was going to issue an order like this, it might encourage or drive people to perhaps take their, you know, activities outside of the state, go to a different state and carry on their same behaviors as normal, perhaps. And this might not slow the spread, right? It might just increase the spread rate in a different state. And so it became important in this context and the nature of this problem to think about regional solutions when you live in a region like the Northeast with many states, neighboring states in close proximity to one another. And so that takes us back to some of the first things we talked about in class. We have to think about the nature of the problem when we're thinking about policy solutions. Basically, the gist of this order, residents are being told to stay indoors as much as possible, and what are considered to be non-essential businesses are allowed to stay open. But if you're not a non-essential, if you're not considered, essential businesses are allowed to stay open. But if you're not an essential business, you have to keep your workers at home. And if you can work from home, that's the preferred approach at this point for non-essential businesses. Now, what are essential businesses? Of course, grocery stores, restaurants offering takeout or delivery. You have convenience stores, liquor stores, and so on. Of course, healthcare providers and pharmacies, gas stations, banks, laundromats, dry cleaners. All of these kind of bullet points identify or qualify as what are considered to be essential services under the executive order. You know, and in some cases, and it's true in New York, that when we think about, again, a policy to address something like the coronavirus, we also have to think about not only something like the spread and how to restrict that spread, but also vulnerable populations, right? And so in this case, we've known this from the start, but although this is dynamic and this is changing, but in particular vulnerable populations are the elderly and people with pre-existing conditions, right? So the governor of California, Newsom, encouraged people over 65 and those with underlying conditions to stay at home. Whereas in New York, essentially New Yorkers over 70 and those with underlying medical conditions can go outside, but only for solitary exercises, and that they also must wear masks if they're in the company of others, right? And so this is designed to keep more vulnerable populations safe in a sense and reduce their likelihood of exposure to the coronavirus. But you are able to go outside, right? And that's important. You can go outside, get some physical exercise, of course, go to the store. I would encourage you, and of course, the laws encourage you. And this isn't a law per se, but you know, you're supposed to stay at a minimum like 6 feet away from others. And this is, again, to prevent the spread. And so I think it's important. I've been going outside, going for walks, getting some exercise and things like this. It's important to do that. rather than stay inside literally all day, but do what you feel comfortable. But if you are outside, and again, the other thing is that these laws, this is a law, so it is enforceable. The question is, how are they going to enforce it, right? If you're outside and a police officer stops you, right, you're getting exercise, or you're going to the store. These are the activities that are deemed acceptable. You're doing laundry. These are deemed acceptable activities. Otherwise, you're supposed to stay inside. And we'll see how this works out. I don't exactly know the fees and fines associated with not following the order, but it is an enforceable order. And so it is important, again, to be aware of that. But again, this executive order in response to the coronavirus provides a nice way, and the way that states are responding to the coronavirus provides a nice way to apply some of the things we've talked about in class, right? Federalism, decentralization, the scale of a problem and how to appropriately respond to that scale. Thinking about regional policies and things of that nature. The other interesting thing to note is that when talking about this particular stay-at-home order that Governor Cuomo implemented for the state of New York, he was really adamant not to call it a shelter-in-place order, right? Where this is what Governor Gavin Newsom in California called it, a shelter-in-place order. Cuomo was really adamant about not calling it that. He said that particular phrase evoked, might evoke feelings or bring back feelings or remind people of things like an active shooter situation. During the Cold War era, concerns about nuclear war. And so instead in his press briefings, he referred to it as like closing the valve, right? Reducing the amount of people that are outside. And this is kind of an example of how he's framing the policy, right? He wants to capture as much support and like not cause a lot of panic with the way he's addressing this problem. And he thought that using a shelter-in-place phrase to refer to the order might evoke, feelings and concerns related to people who may have experienced things like active shooter situations and maybe have lived through the Cold War era and lived through concerns about nuclear war. And so that's an example of how he's framing his policies related to the coronavirus in terms of these kind of stay-at-home orders. He doesn't want to call it a shelter-in-place, and that's how he's framing it. Right, framing the issue and the policies designed to address this issue. And so again, this all provides kind of a nice way to think about these things. And I'm just clearing my throat. I'm not feeling under the weather at all. But so again, I'll post this article that you can kind of read through it and explore it. I don't know if you can hear it, but my cat is snoring and she might wake up at some point and interfere with the video. But anyway, so this is here, all right? So the next thing I want to do is just jump into lecture for today. And so the first thing I want to do before we get into that is talk about the midterm exam, all right? So the midterm exam is going to be next Tuesday. It's going to be on Blackboard. I'll post multiple notifications about this when it becomes available. Once it becomes available, and it'll be available to the end of Wednesday, okay? Wednesday at 11:59, but I'll provide, again, clear directions on this and the opening and closing time. But the midterm is strictly going to be multiple choice, right? And presumably it's an open book exam, open note, open book, I guess, open internet exam. So, again, under the conditions, like, I don't want this to be an extremely challenging experience for you. I do want you to learn the material, but there are, loosened expectations in terms of how I can convey the material and what I expect you to really absorb under the conditions, and that many of you, might not prefer the online format. So in trying to make things easier, the multiple choice or the midterm exam is going to be multiple choice. So it'll be about, I haven't totally completed at this point, maybe 30 to 40 questions or so. Rather than the hour and 15 minutes, again, just to provide a big window of time, it might only take you 45 minutes, but let's say it takes you longer. I'm going to give you 2 hours. And if you receive extra time for exams, you'll get that extra time allotted to you. And so, you will be provided those. I'll manually set that up in Blackboard. But if you don't, qualify for, like time and a half for your exam, you'll be given 2 hours, unless otherwise noted. The study guide is available as of Tuesday. It'll be up on Blackboard. And it's going to be located in a folder in the course materials called Midterm Exam. And so the study guide is designed to help you kind of zero in on material that will be covered in the midterm and will be presented to you in multiple choice format. All right. I don't design multiple choice questions with the intention of tricking you or things like that. I try to make it as clear as possible. I'm going to try extra hard to do that, given that we don't have like an interaction during the exam. But yeah, so it will be available for you to do on Blackboard. You'll have 2 hours. Once you open it, once you open the exam, you'll have 2 hours to complete it. All right. So just remember, you can't open it and close it. And I'll remind you this on Thursday, but you can't just open it and close it and come back to it when you want to. Once you open it, you'll have 2 hours to do it. And that should be plenty of time to complete the exam. Okay, but again, I'll create a thread on the discussion board related to midterm exam questions. If you have concerns about this format or concerns about using this format on Blackboard, shoot me an email. We'll figure it out. We can have a Zoom meeting or something like this, and maybe I'll have an office hour with Zoom that people can tune into if they want to leading up to the exam. But I'm trying to make it as easy as possible for everybody, and that's really the goal here, okay? So now I want to get into lecture, and today we're going to finish up chapter 3, talking about instruments of public policy, okay? And following this, we're going to get into chapter 4, and that's going to be policy analysis. And we're really going to try, or I'm going to try to really integrate, that's where we're going to kind of dive deep into doing policy analysis and how you can actually do analysis to look at problems. And like I said, I'm getting rid of the paper. I said this in my last, in the syllabus video. We're not going to have a paper for this class anymore, but I am going to ask you to apply policy analysis, and I'm going to ask you to apply it probably to the issue of the coronavirus. And I'll give you a lot of direction on this. It'll most likely be done on the discussion board. But I think we're going to really zero in on policy analysis and apply the concepts related to policy analysis to a real policy issue that's current and relevant, the coronavirus, right? But before we get into that, I want to finish up kind of the basics of public policy and talk about instruments of policy. And what instruments of policy are is essentially they're the tools, the policy tools that government and policymakers use to address public problems, right? So if you think about a toolbox, right? These tools, regulation, taxing, spending, market mechanisms, government management, education, these are all different tools, right? When you're given a problem that policymakers, they're kind of the basic tools of the trade, right? So you look at a problem, you look at the nature of the problem, the context of the problem, and you decide which tool or which collection of tools might be the most appropriate to address that particular issue. And so we're going to look at each of these in turn. The quiz that I'm going to post and will be due by the end of day Wednesday, 11:59 p.m. Wednesday, will ask you to identify a particular tool given a particular policy. And so it's relatively simple, but these are the basic tools that policymakers use to address public problems, right? And so the first policy instrument is regulation. And regulation fundamentally is just basically a government order that requires citizens to do something or keeps them from doing something, right? So the classic example is a speed limit, right? And essentially regulation, let me back up, a speed limit, right? So you're establishing an order to follow or not exceed a particular speed. If you do exceed that speed and you get caught, right, it's enforced. You might get a ticket, a fine, and this is to incentivize you to reduce or not, act out on certain behavior. In this case, speeding in a vehicle, right? And so this is a form of what is also referred to as command and control regulation, where you command the public or businesses to do a particular thing, and you control that behavior. Right. I also like to think of this as kind of the stick-based approach, where you can think of someone waving a stick, right? If you don't do this, I'm going to get you, right? I'm going to penalize you. I'm going to punish you. And so typically command and control regulations establish specific requirements, such as setting a speed limit, establishing rules on when you can leave your residence and things like this. And this is designed to ensure compliance by individuals, corporations, or other units of government to, again, modify behavior and reduce the occurrence or incidence or scale of a public problem or magnitude of the problem, right? And so certainly oftentimes command and control regulations are, established and enforced, and typically they're enforced through fines, perhaps imprisonment, right? But these are things that you have to follow or else, right? If you don't follow the rules, they are enforced. If you get caught for being not in compliance with the rules, you might get a fine, you may be imprisoned, there's punishment, right? And that's a classic regulatory approach that is used. It's oftentimes referred to as command and control regulation. I also like to just remember it as kind of the stick-based approach to controlling people's behavior. And so, yes, so I already covered that last bullet point, right? So the next policy tool I want to talk about is taxing and spending. This is essentially basically when government charges or provides money to encourage or discourage particular behaviors, right? So if government wants to, those are kind of in reverse there. Let me just fix this really quick. Sorry about that. Just relax for a second. See what happens when you don't proofread. I don't know why it's bothering me. Oh well, forget it. Okay, back to the lecture. So the government charges, so again, taxing and spending is typically implemented when the government, again, all of this has to do with changing behavior, right? And so in the case of taxing and spending, the government might charge people something in order to discourage a particular behavior, or they might provide money to individuals or businesses in order to encourage behavior, right? And so taxing and spending is unique from kind of the command and control regulation. It's considered to be an incentive-based policy rather than command and control. We're not commanding you to do something and controlling your behavior. The government is incentivizing you to change your behavior, right? You don't have to do something, but we might charge you to do it, right? Or if you do something, we'll give you money. So we're incentivizing you to practice certain behaviors. And so this is often how I like to think about this as kind of a carrot-based approach to modifying behavior, right? It's incentive-based. I'm giving you, I'm dangling the stick with the carrot in front of you to encourage you to behave in a certain way. A classic example of the taxing and spending approach is, of course, a tax, where a tax is levied on a particular behavior in order to discourage an activity. So, if we talk about like smoking, right? Smoking is considered to be unhealthy, particularly for certain members of the population. The government, doesn't want to restrict your ability to smoke and criminalize or make it illegal to smoke tobacco, I guess. But they didn't want to encourage it, right? And so many states we've seen, New York being one of them, have instituted different taxes, right? And essentially the idea is that as the taxes increase, as the cost of smoking increases, fewer people will choose to smoke, right? Because the question is, how much do you value those cigarettes, right? And those who value cigarettes a lot will pay a lot to smoke, but those who are kind of in between, as the price of cigarettes goes up, their rate of smoking will go down. And that's what a tax is intended to do. We see taxes implemented on liquor, gasoline, and so typically a tax is implemented in order to discourage, right? You're charging people to you're charging people who behave in a certain way to behave that way. The idea is to disincentivize or discourage that behavior. And oftentimes, the goal with taxes is that the kind of upside with taxes is that they bring in revenue, right? And so tax money, if the government issues a tax, they're collecting revenue. That revenue goes into the government bank, essentially, the treasury, and then can be reallocated to carry out certain services. It becomes revenue that can be spent to carry out programs and services at the government level. A really rational policy, like if we think about taxing on cigarettes, right? What does smoking cause, right? You have issues like lung cancer, emphysema, different, of course, respiratory related illnesses. And so perhaps a really rational policy around cigarette taxes would take in that revenue that's brought in from smoking and people who purchase cigarettes and use it to fund, perhaps research on smoking related illnesses. But nonetheless, they're revenue generating types of policies, taxes are. They bring in revenue. And again, they're designed to discourage behavior. Aside from the taxing, you have, again, spending. So spending is designed to encourage certain behavior. And one type of spending is what's called a subsidy. And this is where essentially the government provides monetary payment to assist an industry or business so that the price of the commodity on the market remains low enough to keep it competitive with maybe alternative options, right? And so the idea here is to decrease the price of a particular commodity so that the market for that product increases, right? That more people purchase it. An example of this is like electric cars, right? And subsidies are generally applied directly to industry or business, but you can also benefit from subsidies, right? There's certain programs in different states that incentivize people to buy things like electric vehicles, where if you buy an electric vehicle, you can get a rebate, right? You show that you bought this thing and the government sends you some money for buying that thing. The idea here, again, and we've talked about this, is that typically the government wants to subsidize things, decrease the price of things that are considered to provide for the public good, right? And so if a government thinks something is good, they want to see more of it in the market. And so they might subsidize, they might provide subsidies to decrease the cost and therefore the price of that product to increase the consumption of it in society, right? And so that's what a subsidy is intended to do. And it applies, generally we see it to businesses, but it can also trickle down to the consumer through things like rebate programs. When you purchase a particular product, you can sit in your receipt or proof of purchase and you get some money back. And that's, again, to encourage you to buy certain products and encourage businesses, companies that make that particular product to invest and expand and continue making that product. There's also, in my context, in terms of renewable energy, a lot of subsidies to promote the production of renewable energy, which provides a number of benefits, perhaps things like energy security, lower cost energy. You don't have fluctuations in the market such as you see with oil. And so again, a lot of this is considered to be good. You want to provide stability to a market. You want to lower the price of the product on the market and increase the size of the market share for that particular product. And that's what a subsidy does. The other type of spending is just direct spending, right? This is just a direct payment of money. Typically spending is done, and we'll talk about this when we talk about economic and budgetary policy, but typically spending is done by the government, where they give direct, money directly to certain offices to fund the programs that they implement, right? So this is direct spending by government. Sometimes the government does direct spending to the public or to private entities. We're currently looking at a policy like that, and we'll talk more about that once it comes to fruition. But the Congress is currently working on a stimulus package that will likely give money directly to the public in order to address the issue of layoffs that many people are experiencing as a result of closures of businesses related to mitigating the spread of coronavirus. And so government spending typically is done through the budgetary process, where the Congress and the president or the governor and the state legislature determine how much money they want to give to certain programs for them to carry out their activities and implement policies. But at times, the government also gives money directly to the public or to businesses. Another example of this is like student loans, where you get a federal loan. This is not an example of a subsidy. It's not necessarily lowering the cost of tuition, right? It's giving you money to go to school. And perhaps maybe a loan is not the best example of that, but like a scholarship or some type of government-funded fellowship where you don't necessarily have to pay it back. I guess the Pell Grant, right? The Pell Grant is a good example of government spending. You don't have to pay that back. If you meet certain qualifications, you get the money. The intention is that you use that money to go to school, buy books. And so the Pell Grant is a good example of government spending to support education. Another type of policy instrument are market mechanisms. And we've talked about the market before, But we live in a society that's based on market-based economics, this idea of supply and demand, and letting supply and demand kind of dictate how society operates. We do live in an embedded market system where there are regulations around the market. Um, we don't have a free market system in the classic sense. But essentially, in some areas, the government does kind of let the market do its thing, right? In certain areas of policy, there's less perhaps regulation on the market than others. One example of this is like perhaps the internet, right? If we think about federal government and the regulation of internet commerce, right? You see instances, and this is also true at the state level, where when you're buying things online, in some instances, in some cases, you might not have to pay a state level sales tax. And again, this is an example where you kind of don't necessarily have regulation of those sales going on. The government is not collecting revenue on these types of products, and you're allowing the market to kind of exist in the absence of actual regulation of the cost and value of purchases through taxation. Another example of market mechanisms, and a particular policy example, is what's called cap and trade. This is largely, it's been applied a lot and discussed a lot in the context of environmental policy. But what cap and trade is it's a certain policy program that's kind of a combination between command and control and incentive-based policies, where essentially you establish a cap on something, but you also allow a market to operate in order to allocate how that cap is operationalized. I'll give an example in a second. But basically, cap and trade is this type of model that's considered to be more flexible than command and control. And it's also considered to be more economically efficient, right? Where the cost of policy, the cost of regulating something is not as great as just restricting it altogether, right? And so how cap and trade works, and again, we often see this in the context of environmental policy, is if we're talking about something like emissions of some type of pollution, right? Let's say there's a pollution that exists, and this conversation has been very common when we talk about climate change, where you have companies that are emitting something that's considered to be undesirable, that's considered to be bad, right? And so the idea here is we want to reduce those emissions or reduce a certain type of pollution. We don't want to just outright restrict pollution because that might be very costly to the economy. And so maybe we consider cap and trade, right? And so cap and trade essentially establishes a cap on emissions, right? Perhaps over a particular industry. This could be statewide, nationwide, but you cap emissions of all the companies or businesses that are emitting a certain type of pollution within a particular political jurisdiction. You cap it, right? And how you kind of allow flexibility is that each polluter might get permits to pollute, right? If I pollute a lot, historically, maybe I get 100 permits. For each ton of pollution, I get 1 permit, and I emit 100 tons of pollution a year, so I get 100 permits. Well, let's say there's another producer of pollution that exists somewhere else in the region, and they historically emit only 10 tons of pollution. So they get 10 credits, 10 units of pollution, these permits, right? And what these permits are is they basically allow a certain amount of pollution to exist, right? That if I get 100 credits or permits for pollution, that's how much I'm allowed to emit. If I emit more than that, I might get fined or penalized, right? But let's say, and over time, the idea, so if you have one company emitting 100 tons and another emitting 10, you have 110 tons of pollution being emitted. It means that over time, they're going to reduce that cap. So it's ultimately in a slower fashion than just command and control. They're going to try to slowly, gradually reduce pollution. The way that this trades, so you've capped pollution with the intention of lowering it over time, but you also allowed trading to occur, right? So each of these permits to pollute, right, are tradable in what you might call a market, right? A market type of system for pollution, a pollution market, right? And so let's say that, I'm emitting 100 tons of pollution, and that, the total cap of 110 is going to go down. I'm emitting 100 tons of pollution. I have 100 permits. But the cost of me reducing my pollution, perhaps by implementing some new type of technology, I can maybe retrofit my power plant easier or at a lower cost, right? So let's say I put in some new technology that reduces my emissions. Whereas maybe the plant that's emitting 10 tons of pollution has older technology, or it's going to cost them a lot more to reduce their emissions, right? So if I can reduce my emissions at a relatively low cost, then I have extra permits. And as that cap decreases, even though I might be losing permits, if I decrease my pollution faster than the way that cap is decreasing, I'm going to have extra permits left over. But maybe that other company that's emitting 10 tons is having a harder time, or it's going to be very expensive for them to reduce their emissions. They also don't want to pay the fee. So I can sell them, right? My leftover permits. I can recover some money based on the expenses I'd use, the money that I spent to reduce my emissions. But if you're willing to pay, or if that company is willing to pay me more than I spent to reduce my pollution, I make money off the situation. And if I sell that company permits to pollute that are the price is lower than their cost of reducing their pollution, it's also lower than perhaps the fines that they would receive for polluting above the cap, they're also better off, right? And so this is considered a more efficient outcome, right? Where there's less loss to industry, the polluters, but you're still achieving the desired goal of pollution reduction. And me, if I can reduce my pollution and I have extra permits to sell, I can make money off of the situation. And so this is considered a market-based approach to regulation of, in this case, pollution. And it's considered, again, more optimal in many cases to the traditional just command and control approach because you're providing flexibility. It also might be better than just taxing, perhaps in some cases, taxing the polluters, which would generate revenue, but a polluter might just decide to pay the tax and continue to pollute, right? And so here with the cap and trade, you're capping pollution, you're controlling the actual amount of pollution that's occurring, but you're also allowing flexibility in terms of trading. And so you're adding to that kind of efficient outcome. And that's the idea behind this market-based approach to controlling pollution. Another type of policy instrument is just government management, right? And this is essentially where the government just takes control of a certain service or manages a particular region's resources, right? A lot of times, cities and if we talk about waste management, in a lot of cities, people who work for waste management work for the city, right? The city provides that essential service. And again, these are areas where there might not be a private market for it, right? Where, if you just left up waste management to the private market, it might not produce an efficient outcome for people who live in a particular city, right? Where people who can pay to have their trash picked up, pay that fine or pay that fee and have their trash cleaned up, but those who can't afford to have their trash picked up are left with trash. And so, in many ways, government management of certain services in order to provide for the public good and the well-being of everyone is warranted. If also we think about a beach, right? A beach, and we talked about this like open access resources. In many ways, a beach or a park could be considered a public good, where allowing the private market to provide those types of goods might not produce efficient outcomes. And so the government steps in to kind of provide these types of resources to the public in order to improve overall social well-being within a particular region. And so there's a lot of examples, and a lot of times these examples where the government manages a particular thing applies to what we call public goods, right? Things that are open access, non-subtractive in consumption, and therefore there might not be a private market for it, right? I can't exclude your use of this resource. And if you use some of it, it doesn't reduce everybody else's ability to use it, right? We talk about public goods. Government management is often the provider of those things. And so this is where the policy tool of government management might be most appropriate. There are cases though, and we see this with things in some cases, in some cities, in some locations with like waste management or water management even, where the government partners with private entities to provide things like waste services, waste disposal services, or water services. And so sometimes the government does this by contracting services out to private companies, but they are essentially, and the idea here is that, the government might be limited in resources. The idea is that a private business has incentives to be efficient, right? If you live in New York City, if you deal with city government or the bureaucrats in the city, right? A lot of times people complain that city workers are not very efficient at what they do. This is a common complaint. I'm not saying that it's true in all cases, but this is a frequent complaint. Whereas a private company has incentives to be efficient, to perform services in a low cost way, and be quick with getting things done, because then they can move on to the next thing and essentially increase their profit, right? And so this is often why public partnerships are created, right? To improve the efficiency of services as they're provided. It is important to note that in this case, the public sector remains responsible for ensuring that city residents are provided with quality services, especially if we're talking about things like water quality. And in the past, if you look at certain cases, there have been issues with private entities following through with providing quality services, right? If we think about water, for example, again, it's in a private company's interest to maximize profits, right? Which is essentially the core of a market model for a firm, a business. And so in maximizing profits, they might do so at the consequence of those who use the service, because they have a contract with the city. They have guaranteed income through that contract. They might in some ways cut corners, perhaps, that might have detrimental impacts to those who use that service. And we've seen this happen with things like water quality in certain locations. Ultimately, it's important when we talk about public-private partnerships that the city establishes a really clear and detailed contract with that private entity in order to ensure that the services that are being provided are of a particular quality, and that quality is provided in a way that maximizes benefits to residents of that particular city or state, the people that are receiving the services from that private entity. And so that's government management, right? Typically we see government management when we're talking about things like public goods, something where there's no private market for providing those services. Government management might be the appropriate thing in order to provide public goods. But also at times when we talk about these things, we see a mixture of government management and private management through what are called public-private partnerships. And so we also see this with things like prisons, and this is an important conversation that's come up in policy discussions recently, or like private prisons, for-profit prisons. And again, the profit motive in these systems might be at the detriment of the quality of life that people who are in jail or prison are provided. It might be a really efficient way to manage jails and decrease government spending on things like jails. But is it providing the quality of service that we expect for certain populations? And this has become a controversial discussion in public policy related to jails and prison institutions of late. And so that's that. The last one I want to talk about, the last policy instrument, is broadly called, education, information, persuasion. And this is another tool that policymakers can use to, again, kind of alter behavior, right? And you can use information, education, and persuasion to alter the behavior of the public, like consumers. We can also use it to incentivize certain behaviors from the private sector, businesses and companies, right? And the idea with this policy tool is to provide information, right? The classic example of this is like the nutrition facts on a food product, right? Where you can look at the information on that food product and determine, right, whether or not you want to purchase that product. You might be looking for certain things, maybe sugar, calories, certain health-related components that might be of specific interest to you. And the idea here is just to inform, enlighten, and empower individuals to build kind of capital or capacity, knowledge capacity, to allow you to make informed decisions, right? And we talked about, market failure. One of the market failures is a lack of information. And this is particularly relevant for consumers. or if you don't have good information about a product, you might be buying a product that is below the level of quality that you prefer. You might be misinformed about the product, and it might cause negative harm to you. And so, nutrition labels are a classic example of providing information to allow consumers to make informed decisions and kind of account for that market failure. The other thing is that, and this information can be provided in a number of ways. It can be as simple as a nutrition label. It could also be that you go through certain training activities to get information in a more structured and formal way. You could also qualify for like getting certain technical assistance in some areas to get information and understand about certain issues. And this kind of information, education, and persuasion approach is often used when we talk about issues such as health and human safety and environmental protection. And so a lot of information and education is geared towards the consumer and providing information to the consumer or perhaps people who work in a certain area. And that's where training and technical assistance comes into play. If you work in a particular industry that might pose some risks, right? The idea is that you as an employee are provided with information about those risks so that you're not taking risks and risking your health. I said risk a lot, but so you're not risking your health in ways that you're uninformed about. But the other side, so a lot of it focuses on the consumer or the person who's voluntarily engaging in that behavior. Information can also incentivize businesses to behave in a certain way, right? So if you create a law or a policy that requires businesses to be transparent about some of their practices, right? If we're talking about sustainability practices, right? One example of this is like organic food products, right? That in most cases you have to meet certain criteria to label your product as organic, right? And many people view organic perhaps as being more healthy. And if we're talking about eggs, you also have things like free range chickens, right? And many people might say that free range eggs or eggs produced from chickens who are free range is more ethical, right? So you're allowing consumers to make informed decisions. And if there's a demand for those types of products, by requiring businesses to meet certain criteria in order to qualify to label themselves as like organic or free range, this might incentivize businesses, as long as there's a demand for that market, to alter their practices. This has also been effective when we talk about certain businesses that might be using chemicals or substances that are perhaps environmentally damaging. There have been laws passed in the past that require companies to disclose things like chemical products that they're using to produce the products that they're making and selling. And so when you require a company to disclose, if you go on like the US EPA's website, there's a law called the Toxic Release Inventory that essentially requires companies to dispose or to disclose what types of chemicals they're using in products. It kind of creates a transparent, it's like a sunshine law is what you think of it as, where you're revealing information. And the idea is that if I'm a company and I'm doing things that if the public knew that I was doing, it might create a bad image for me, right? I might do those things if I know that that those things won't be revealed, right? But when you have a law that requires disclosure of certain activities, of certain chemicals, of certain business practices, when that information is becoming publicly available and I have to provide that information, and I know that interest groups or the general public may become aware of my behavior, it might incentivize me to behave in a different way. And that's what this can also do. When you provide information, it not only allows consumers to make informed decisions, but it also might incentivize businesses to behave in certain ways that the general public or interest groups might consider to be more desirable or more ethical. And businesses might be incentivized to change their behavior in order to not get bad publicity or receive bad publicity or a bad name for how they practice themselves. The animation on this slide is kind of screwed up. But anyway, so the last thing I want to talk about, this is the last slide, is that essentially Um, all instruments, all policy tools can kind of be discussed into three different types. So, and this particularly applies to when we talk about regulatory instruments, regulation, taxing and spending, and the market-based approaches. Um, and when we talk about government intervention, you have regulatory approaches where government restricts individual choice in order to prevent them from crossing certain boundaries that are considered to be undesirable. That's the command and control based approach. When we talk about things like taxing and spending or market based approaches, policies that bring in money, right? And we'll talk about this when we talk about economy and budget. But that the government is often collecting money from the general public, right? And the government also has programs and policies in place that provide money to individuals in society. Um, there's two types of spending along these lines. One is distributive, right? Where there's distributive programs that provide money from the government to individuals or businesses. Um, and sometimes this is provided to individuals or businesses that meet specific criteria. Other times it's not. So the Pell Grant is a good example. Um, or let me back up. The Pell Grant is not such a good example in this case. But certain grants that everybody qualifies for. So, for example, if we talk about, and we'll talk more about this, but the current stimulus package that's being discussed in the Congress is kind of like a distributive package where what's currently on the table is to give money to the general public. Everyone who meets certain income requirements will get a check of a certain amount, right? And so this is this distributive policy where you're providing money to individuals. Of course, there are different tiers of how much money you will get. The idea is the more money you make, the less you might receive from the stimulus package. But there is a distributive nature to this particular stimulus package. Also in the package is money to certain businesses and companies. And that's a big debate right now, is which companies should receive money, essentially to be bailed out by the stimulus package. But this is a distributive policy. We're distributing money to the general public, to businesses, and there is structure to it. But for the most part, there's not a whole lot of criteria established other than determining who gets it and how much they get. This is different from what are called redistributive policies, right? Redistributive policies are programs set up by the government that essentially provide benefits to a particular category of individuals at the expense of other individuals, right? And one example or common examples of this are things like welfare, Social Security, affirmative action we'll talk about when we talk about education policy. But the idea with redistributive policies is that they bring in money, right? So, or the policy itself doesn't bring in money, but let's say through a tax, you're bringing in money, like an income tax. Anybody who works and pays taxes is putting money into the state treasury or the federal treasury, right? But there are certain programs that tax money might be distributed to that not everybody gets, right? So, social welfare programs are generally income-based. Pell Grants are often income-based. And so if you qualify to receive that money, you have to meet a certain criteria. And so with like welfare, Social Security, everybody pays into these things, but not everybody sees the benefit of paying that money into those programs, right? So this is called redistributive, where you're taking money in these cases through income tax, Social Security tax. You're taking in money from everybody, but the money that's brought in from these programs only benefits certain members or components or groups within society. And this is called redistributive policy. You're bringing in money and you're redistributing it, right? This is unique from distributive policy, where there's less kind of criteria in terms of qualifications of who gets what. And redistributive policies are often politically controversial. Again, the idea is that the classic argument is, why should I pay into this when I'm not really benefiting from it, right? And so redistributive policies can often be very politically contentious in policy debates as beliefs about the role of government and certain programs are influenced by values and how government ought to efficiently spend public money. And so that's the last thing I want to talk about. The final item is that there is a quiz that is on Blackboard. That quiz is due Wednesday at 11:59 p.m., right? The quiz is related to the policy tools discussion. It's related also to the discussion I had at the beginning of the lecture regarding New York policy regarding the coronavirus. And so you'll have the lecture in front of you, you'll have your book presumably available, you'll have the article. The quiz doesn't have a time frame on it. Again, it's really just intended to make sure you're staying up to date with the reading. And so please take the quiz by Wednesday, 11:59 p.m. And this is just to keep you up to date with the class material and reading. All right, so we'll get the next lecture up on Thursday. If you have questions in the meantime, you could post questions related to lecture in the related thread on Blackboard. You could send any other questions directly to my email. We'll talk a little bit more about the midterm and what to expect on Thursday. But in the meantime, you could check out the study guide in the midterm folder and course materials. And I hope all of you stay safe, stay healthy, and continue to exercise your mind, exercise your body, try to stay low stress as possible. All right, we'll see you next time.